3 inches from Jesse's face, synthetic oil leaked from a cracked casing, pooling on the shop floor around the steel-toed boots of a man who had killed people for a lot less than wasting his time. The blistering heat radiating off the engine block smelled of copper and burning hair. Outside the rusted garage doors, 700 Hell's Angels were camped out, drinking his town dry. They had given him until sunrise to fix a $2.5 million machine that 3 master builders had already declared dead. His hands were shaking. The vibrations hit the floorboards before the sound actually reached the shop. Jesse was underneath a beaten-up 98 Tacoma, fighting a seized tie rod end with a breaker bar and half a can of WD-40. The rust flakes kept dropping into his eyes, mixing with the sweat and the cheap hangover he'd been nursing since Tuesday. It was a Thursday in Barstow. The air outside was 98 degrees and felt like breathing through a dirty wool blanket. Then the concrete began to hum. It started low, a subtle tremor in the back of his molars, the kind of frequency a person feels in their chest cavity. His socket wrench vibrated off the transmission jack and hit the floor with a flat metallic clang. He slid out from under the truck on the creeper, wiping grease across his forehead with the back of a filthy glove. Through the cracked plexiglass of the garage bay door, the horizon was thick with a dust cloud that looked like a localized sandstorm. Then came the noise. It wasn't the synchronized, tuned roar of a parade. It was a chaotic, guttural mechanical thunder, hundreds of V-twins running hot, out of sync, spitting unburnt fuel and violence into the desert air. He stood up, his knees popping. The cheap fluorescent lights overhead flickered as the grid struggled with the sheer vibration hitting the building. He walked to the roll-up door and yanked the heavy chain. The metal screamed as it went up, letting in a blast of dry heat and the overpowering stench of hot asphalt, exhaust, and unwashed leather. They were pouring down Main Street. 2 by 2, then 4 by 4, an endless river of black denim, chrome, and sunburned skin. Hell's Angels. The California chapters judging by the rockers on their backs, but mixed with patches he didn't recognize. Nevada. Arizona. Nomads. The town's single traffic light, eternally blinking yellow, was completely ignored. Cars were pulling off onto the gravel shoulders, drivers staring straight ahead, hands locked on steering wheels, trying to be invisible. He leaned against the brickwork of the shop, feeling a cold knot form in his gut. He'd run to this dead-end town 3 years ago to get away from heavy people and heavy debts. He kept his head down, fixed lawnmowers and blown head gaskets, and drank cheap beer. He didn't want trouble. The river of bikes began to slow. The lead riders, massive men with road-weary faces and heavily tattooed arms, started angling their front tires toward his cracked concrete apron. No, he thought. Keep going. The interstate is 2 miles down. They didn't keep going. They swarmed the lot. Bikes hopped the curb, kicking up loose gravel that pinged against the aluminum siding of his shop. Kickstands dropped in a staggered metallic wave. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure against his eardrums, until one by one the engines were killed. The sudden silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, expectant. A man in the center of the pack dismounted. He was tall, lean, built like a piece of rebar. His face looked like leather that had been left out in the rain and dried over a fire. Silver hair tied back, a thick silver beard, and eyes that were completely flat, void of any immediate emotion. His cut bore the patch of a president. He didn't look at Jesse. He looked back at a massive, custom-built flatbed truck that was slowly lumbering into the lot behind the bikes. The truck hissed, air brakes locking, and the heavy hydraulic ramp began to whine as it lowered. "You Jesse?" the president asked. His voice was a low, gravel churn. He didn't raise it, but in the quiet it carried perfectly. "Depends who's asking," Jesse said. It was a stupid, movie cliché thing to say. His throat was dry. "I'm Dutch," he said, finally turning those flat eyes on him. "Heard you used to work for the old man in San Bernardino before he went away. Heard you have hands that don't quit." "I fix trucks now," Jesse said, his voice betraying a slight crack. "Commuter cars. I don't do custom work anymore." Dutch pulled a crushed pack of Marlboros from his chest pocket, lit one with a Zippo, and snapped the lid shut. The metallic clink was loud. "You do today." The hydraulic ramp hit the asphalt. 4 huge guys walked up and carefully began unstrapping a motorcycle. When they rolled it down into the harsh desert sunlight, the air in the lot seemed to shift. The other bikers stepped back, giving it space. It was a panhead, but modified beyond recognition. The frame was raw, blued steel, stretched and raked. The engine block was a massive, scarred hunk of polished billet aluminum, laced with intricate, almost obsessive hand-machined cooling fins. But it was the details that made Jesse's stomach drop. The pushrod tubes were solid platinum. The fuel lines were braided with an alloy he couldn't immediately identify, gleaming with a dull, heavy luster. The gas tank was painted a deep, impossible black, with the club's death head insignia faintly ghosted into the clear coat, barely visible unless the light hit it perfectly. Jesse knew this bike. Everyone in the underground fabrication world knew it, though mostly as a myth. It was the Sovereign, built by a founding member in the 70s, constantly upgraded, entirely bespoke. Rumor was the engine casings were cast from melted-down weapons confiscated during a brutal turf war, and the internals were engineered with tolerances tighter than aerospace tech. Appraisers, the shadowy ones who value black market artifacts, put it at $2.5 million, mostly for the history and the raw precious metals hiding in plain sight. It was rolling history, and right now it was a paperweight. The front cylinder looked scorched. A thick trail of dried, blackened fluid ran down the primary drive. "She died outside Barstow," Dutch said, taking a drag. "Locked up tight at 80 miles an hour, nearly threw coal into a semi." He gestured to a younger guy nursing a severely road-rashed arm. "Look, man," Jesse said, holding up his greasy, shaking hands. "I don't have the tools for that. That's a bespoke machine. If the bottom end is seized, I can't just order parts from a catalog. You need a CNC machine. You need a clean room. I need it running by tomorrow morning." Dutch interrupted, stepping closer. He smelled of old sweat, tobacco, and gun oil. "We're supposed to be in Vegas for a sit-down. The Sovereign has to be there. It's a matter of club respect." He stepped into Jesse's personal space. Jesse could see the individual gray hairs in his beard. 700 of my brothers are going to pitch tents in this town tonight," Dutch said softly. "They are thirsty. They are irritated. If you fix it, I'll hand you 50 grand in cash and we leave your little hiding spot in peace. If you don't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jesse looked at the bike. He looked at the sea of patched vests, the cold, staring faces. He looked back at his dirty hands. "Roll it into Bay 2. Jesse swallowed hard. "And get out of my light." The shop felt claustrophobic. Usually the high ceilings and open bays felt cavernous, lonely even. Now the air was entirely sucked out of the room. Dutch had allowed 3 guys to stay inside the shop, 2 massive prospects who stood like granite pillars by the exits, and a guy named Reno, a mechanic for the club who looked at Jesse with open disdain. Outside, the town of Barstow was being occupied. Through the thin walls, Jesse could hear the constant low-level hum of heavy boots on gravel, the clinking of beer bottles, the occasional shout. They had taken over the diner across the street, the motel next door, and the gas station. Local law enforcement was conspicuously absent. The sheriff had likely locked himself in his office and thrown away the key until they moved on. Jesse wiped down his stainless steel workbench. His rag left streaks of dirty solvent. He needed a clean space. He needed his head clear. Reno crossed his arms. He had a spiderweb tattooed over his right elbow and hands that looked like they'd been crushed in a vice and healed wrong. "You're wasting your time, wrench," he sneered. "The crank is fused. We had it apart on the side of the 15. The main bearing shattered. Shrapnel everywhere. You can't rebuild that without a factory press and a new set of custom flywheels." Jesse didn't answer him. He grabbed a rolling stool, kicked it over to the bike, and sat down. Up close, the Sovereign was intimidating. It wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a physical manifestation of a violent culture's pride. He ran a bare hand over the primary cover. The metal was still radiating heat. The texture was perfectly smooth, cold-rolled steel, unmarked by the years. He leaned in, closing his eyes, taking a breath. He tried to separate the smell of the men in the room from the smell of the machine. There it was, the sharp, acrid tang of burned synthetic oil, but beneath it, something else. A sweet, cloying scent. Glycol? No, this was an air-cooled engine. It smelled almost like caramelized sugar and melting copper. "Give me a 3/8 drive and a T40 Torx," Jesse said, holding his hand out without looking back. Nobody moved. He turned his head. Reno was glaring at him. "I'm not your tool boy, Runaway." Reno spat. Jesse stood up, kicking the stool back. The metal legs screeched against the concrete. He walked right up to Reno. He was terrified, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but exhaustion and the absurdity of the situation triggered a weird, detached anger. "You guys dragged this dead body into my morgue," Jesse said, keeping his voice low, mimicking Dutch's volume. "You told me I have 12 hours to perform a miracle, or your 700 buddies tear my life apart. If I ask for a Torx bit, you put it in my hand, or you can go outside and tell Dutch that you decided to let the bike stay dead." Reno's jaw flexed. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords. For a second, Jesse thought he was going to pull a knife and gut him right there by the tire balancer. Instead, he spun around, stalked over to the toolbox, yanked a drawer open so hard the bearings screamed, and snatched the tools. He slapped them into Jesse's palm. "It's on your head," he muttered. Jesse sat back down. The metal of the wrench was cool, grounding him. He started backing out the bolts on the timing cover. They were tight, secured with red Loctite, but they gave with a sharp crack. He pulled the cover off and set it gently on a clean blue shop towel. Reno was right. It was a massacre inside. The cam gears were chewed to hell. Metal shavings, glittering like morbid confetti, were plastered against the inner walls of the case, held there by thick, sludge-like oil. The pushrods were bent out of shape. The engine hadn't just seized, it had cannibalized itself. Jesse pulled a penlight from his shirt pocket and clicked it on. He shined the narrow beam deep into the crankcase. The main bearing, a proprietary piece likely machined from a specific alloy 40 years ago, had exploded. The rollers had turned into jagged shrapnel, wedging themselves between the flywheels and the case. The whole assembly was locked solid. He slumped back on the stool, rubbing the bridge of his nose, leaving a smear of black grease between his eyes. "Told you," Reno said, a smug satisfaction in his voice. "It's a boat anchor. We need a flatbed and a machine shop in LA." "Why did it shatter?" Jesse asked, staring at the mess. "Because it's a machine and machines break," Reno said. "Not this machine," he murmured. "Look at the tolerances. Whoever built this, the old man, he over-engineered everything. The oil pump is high volume. The lines are aircraft grade. This bearing didn't fail from wear and tear. It failed from starvation." He shined the light lower, tracing the oil return line. That's when he saw it. Hidden behind the exhaust mount, tucked away where you'd need a mirror to see it, the heavy braided line was crimped. Not from a crash, not from road debris. It was a precise, unnatural pinch. Someone had tightened a zip tie around the line, a heavy-duty industrial one, then snipped the tail off, so it was nearly invisible in the shadows of the frame. It restricted the oil flow just enough. At normal cruising speeds, it would run hot but survive. At 80 miles an hour across the Mojave Desert in 100-degree heat, it would cook the bearing in 20 miles. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. His stomach did a slow, heavy roll. He clicked the penlight off. The silence in the shop suddenly felt dangerous. If he told Dutch his bike was sabotaged, he'd be in the middle of an internal gang war. People would die. Maybe starting with the messenger. "Well?" Dutch's voice came from the doorway. Jesse hadn't heard him walk in. He moved like a ghost for a big man. Jesse turned around. "Reno's right. The main bearing exploded. The bottom end is completely locked up." Dutch's expression didn't change. "Can you fix it?" Jesse looked at the impossible mess of mangled steel and aluminum. He looked at the hidden, pinched oil line. He looked at the 50 grand in imaginary cash and the very real possibility of his shop burning down. "Yes," Jesse lied, "but I'm going to have to do something you're not going to like." Night fell over Barstow like a suffocating blanket. The heat didn't break. It just lost its blinding glare, settling into the asphalt and radiating back up into the soles of his boots. Outside, the tension had thickened. The low hum of conversations had turned into sporadic shouting, the sound of breaking glass, and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of bad heavy metal playing from a customized bagger's stereo. Inside Bay 2, he had established a perimeter of halogen work lights around the Sovereign. The intense yellow glare turned the immediate area into a hot, bright island. He was sweating through his shirt, the fabric clinging to his back, completely soaked. Dutch and Reno stood at the edge of the light. They hadn't moved in an hour. "I have to split the cases," Jesse told them, wiping his hands on a rag. Reno stepped forward, shaking his head. "No way. You don't split the cases on the Sovereign. The seal on that block was made by the founder. It's not supposed to be broken unless it's going back to the mother chapter." "Then you can push it to Vegas!" Jesse snapped. The exhaustion was stripping away his filter. "The shrapnel is wedged tight. I can't fish it out with a magnet. I have to pull the engine, split the block, grind out the scoring, and find a way to replace a bearing that hasn't been manufactured since 1978. Dutch put a heavy hand on Reno's chest, stopping him from moving closer. "Do it," Dutch said. Jesse nodded, turning back to the bike. Dissecting a masterpiece is a sickening feeling. It's like performing an autopsy on someone you respect. Every bolt was a fight. The engine hadn't been fully dismantled in decades. He had to use an impact driver, leaning his entire body weight into the tool, striking the back of it with a 3-pound dead blow hammer just to break the corrosion on the mounting bolts. Smack! Smack! Crack! The sound echoed off the cinderblock walls. With every crack of a loose bolt, Reno flinched. Jesse rigged a chain hoist to the heavy steel I-beam running across the ceiling. He wrapped heavy nylon straps around the massive billet block, being careful not to scratch the platinum pushrod tubes. "Take the slack," he grunted. Reno didn't move. "I said take the slack," he yelled, the frustration boiling over. Reno glared, but grabbed the chain and pulled until the nylon straps went taut. Jesse unbolted the final motor mount. "Pull," he ordered. The heavy aluminum heart of the Sovereign lifted an inch from the frame. It swung slightly, a dead mechanical pendulum. They guided it over to the workbench, letting it down onto heavy wooden blocks. Now came the real nightmare. Jesse grabbed his propane torch. To split an engine block that has been heat-cycled 1,000 times and sealed with aerospace-grade gasket maker, you need heat. He clicked the igniter. The blue flame roared to life, casting dancing shadows against the tools hanging on his pegboard. He started sweeping the flame along the seam of the engine cases. The smell of burning oil and melting sealant filled the tight space. It smelled toxic, a chemical bitterness that coated the back of his throat. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he couldn't stop to wipe it. The heat had to be perfectly even. Too much in one spot, and the aluminum would warp. If the case warped, the engine would never hold oil pressure again. The $2.5 million bike would become a pile of very expensive scrap metal. For 30 minutes, there was only the hiss of the torch and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Finally, he killed the torch. He picked up a brass drift punch and a hammer. He set the punch against a thick, reinforced tab on the case. He hesitated. His hands were vibrating. If he struck it wrong, he could crack the mounting tab. "Don't freeze up now, wrench," Dutch said from the shadows. His voice was calm, but it held a terrifying weight. Jesse took a deep breath, tasted the metallic tang of the air, and swung the hammer. Tink. Nothing. He hit it harder. Whack! A tiny hairline crack appeared in the grey sealant along the seam. He moved to the other side, tapping, working his way around. He grabbed a pair of pry bars, wedged them gently into the designated leverage points, and pushed. With a sickening wet suction sound, the two halves of the engine block popped apart. Thick, black, metallic sludge oozed out onto the workbench. It looked like blood. He peered inside. It was worse than he thought. The flywheels were deeply grooved, carved up by the hardened steel rollers of the shattered bearing. The crank pin was blued from extreme heat friction. "Well?" Reno demanded, leaning over the table, staring at the guts of the machine. Jesse grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers and reached into the dark, oily cavity of the bottom end. He rooted around in the sludge until he felt the jagged edge of the bearing cage. He clamped down and pulled it out, dropping the twisted, ruined piece of metal onto a clean rag. "It's gone," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need a replacement bearing." "I told you!" Reno barked, turning to Dutch. "It's custom. We don't have one." Jesse looked at the twisted metal. He looked at the ruined flywheels. His mind raced, shuffling through 10 years of mechanical engineering, fabrication, and desperate, redneck ingenuity. He couldn't machine a new bearing from scratch in 6 hours. It was impossible. Unless. He looked up at Dutch. Where did the old man source his parts when he built this in the 70s? He didn't have a CNC machine. He used existing architecture. Dutch frowned. He used whatever he could get his hands on. Agricultural, industrial. He liked things that didn't break. He built the bottom end oversized. Jesse muttered, mostly to himself, grabbing his digital calipers. He wiped the sludge off the crank pin and took a measurement. 2.125 inches. He measured the outer race, still stuck in the case. 3.5 inches. He dropped the calipers onto the bench. A strange, frantic energy started bubbling in his chest. "It's a tractor bearing," he whispered. "What?" Reno snapped. The old man didn't custom machine the bearing. He custom machined the cases to fit an existing heavy-duty bearing. A John Deere main bearing from a 1960s series diesel engine. They used them because they could handle massive torque. Dutch stepped into the light. "Do you have one?" Jesse looked towards the back of his shop, past the broken lawnmowers, into the dark corner where he hoarded junk. There, sitting under a tarp, was a seized 1968 John Deere tractor engine he had bought for $50 2 years ago, intending to use the cast iron for scrap. "Yeah," Jesse said, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. "I think I do, but getting it out is going to be ugly." The John Deere engine was a monument to neglect. It sat in the darkest corner of the shop, half covered by a stiff, oil-stained canvas tarp, functioning primarily as a condominium for desert field mice. When he dragged the tarp off, a cloud of fine, acrid dust plumed into the stagnant air. It smelled like dry rot, mouse urine, and 50-year-old grease. Reno let out a harsh, barking laugh. It echoed off the cinderblock walls, sharp and grating. "You've lost your mind," Reno said. He walked over, kicking the heavy cast-iron block with the steel toe of his boot. A flake of orange rust the size of a playing card broke loose and clattered to the floor. "This is a joke. You're going to put dirt farming garbage into a $2 million motorcycle? The old man would shoot you himself." Jesse ignored him. He didn't have the energy for a pissing contest. His adrenaline was already crashing, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion in his limbs. He grabbed a can of PB Blaster penetrating oil and soaked the massive, rusted bolts holding the tractor's crankcase together. "Dutch!" Reno snapped, turning to his president. "Shut this down. He's disrespecting the club. We need to load the bike and—" "Quiet," Dutch said. He hadn't moved from his spot near the workbench. He was leaning against a tool cabinet, arms crossed, watching Jesse with the detached intensity of a hawk observing a mouse in an open field. "Let the man work." The silence returned, heavier this time. Taking apart an engine that hasn't run since the Nixon administration is an act of physical violence. The bolts were fused to the cast iron, molecularly bonded by decades of oxidation. A standard wrench wouldn't do it. Jesse pulled a 3-foot length of steel cheetah pipe from under his welding table and slipped it over the handle of his heaviest, half-inch drive breaker bar. He set the socket on the first main bolt. He braced his boots against the heavy wooden pallet the engine sat on, wrapped both hands around the end of the steel pipe, and leaned his entire body weight backward. Nothing. The metal didn't even groan. Sweat stung the corners of his eyes. His lower back began to throb, a dull, familiar ache from years of fighting stuck metal. He readjusted his grip, ignoring the grit grinding into his palms. He closed his eyes and pulled again, pulling until black spots danced in his peripheral vision, pulling until the tendons in his neck felt like snapping guitar strings. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. The breaker bar gave way so violently he stumbled backward, slamming his elbow into the side of a drill press. Pain flared up his arm, bright and sharp. "One," he muttered, tasting copper. He spit onto the concrete. It took him an hour to break the remaining 6 bolts. By the time he finished, his knuckles were bleeding, scraped raw against the rough cast iron, and his shirt was plastered to his skin. The air in the bay felt thick enough to chew. He grabbed a crowbar, wedged it into the seam of the tractor block, and heaved. The heavy iron case separated with a dull, wet tear. The smell that hit him was atrocious. Sour, oxidized diesel fuel mixed with dead earth. But there it was. Sitting in the center of the heavy, balanced crankshaft was the main bearing. It was a Timken roller, an over-engineered chunk of American industrial steel designed to pull plows through hard-packed clay for 40 years without complaining. It was coated in a thick layer of black, tar-like sludge, but the cage was intact. Jesse grabbed a pair of heavy leather welding gloves. The iron was cold. He worked the bearing off the crank journal, twisting and pulling until it slid free with a suction pop. It weighed almost 3 pounds on its own. He walked it over to the workbench and dropped it next to the mutilated, hyper-expensive aluminum guts of the Sovereign. "There's your heart transplant," Jesse said, breathing heavily, wiping a mixture of sweat and rust dust from his forehead. Reno stared at the filthy lump of tractor steel, his lip curled in absolute disgust. "It's a piece of junk." "It's high-carbon steel," Jesse countered, his voice flat. "And right now, it's the only thing standing between you and a flatbed ride of shame to Vegas." Dutch finally pushed off the tool cabinet. He walked slowly to the bench, his heavy boots scuffing the concrete. He didn't look at Jesse, nor at Reno. He looked down at the ruined, shattered custom bearing of his club's most prized possession, and then at the filthy, indestructible tractor bearing sitting beside it. "Clean it," Dutch ordered. The part's washer basin was located against the back wall, a stainless steel sink filled with 20 gallons of aggressive mineral spirits. The pump hummed a low, vibrating note when he flicked the switch. He dropped the John Deere bearing into the basin and grabbed a stiff-bristled nylon brush. The chemical smell was an instant relief. It overpowered the stale sweat and the sour diesel, clearing his sinuses with a sharp, toxic bite. He scrubbed. The black sludge dissolved, bleeding off the steel rollers in dark, inky clouds. As the grime washed away, the true nature of the bearing revealed itself. There was no pitting, no scoring. The rollers spun inside the cage with a smooth, buttery resistance. They built things differently in the 60s. He dried it with compressed air. The high-pressure nozzle screamed as it blasted the remaining solvent out of the tight crevices. The bearing was now a dull, flawless grey. He carried it back to the workbench, set it down gently, and picked up his digital micrometer. This was the moment of truth. If the old man had machined his cases even 1/1000th of an inch off standard agricultural specs, this entire desperate plan was dead. He tightened the micrometer around the outer race. The digital display flickered, then held steady. 3.500 inches. He measured the inner diameter, 2.125 inches. It was perfect. A flawless mathematical match. The kind of coincidence that makes a man want to laugh out loud, though his throat was too dry for it. "It fits," he said quietly. He felt Dutch step up right behind him. The heat coming off the man was palpable. "Good," he rumbled. "Now put it together." "I need a minute," Jesse said. "I need to prep the frame. Check the oil lines. If the pump ingested any shrapnel, this new bearing will be dead in 10 miles. It was a half-truth. The pump was likely fine. The filter would have caught the heavy metal. But he had a bigger problem. He couldn't put the engine back into the bike with that pinched oil line. If he did, the engine would seize again before they even crossed the Nevada state line. They'd turn around, come back to Barstow, and burn his shop to the foundation with him inside it. But he also couldn't just announce that someone in the club had sabotaged the president's bike. Reno was standing 10 feet away, glaring holes into the back of his skull. If Reno was the saboteur, exposing him in front of Dutch might trigger a bloodbath right here on his concrete floor. If Reno wasn't the saboteur, it meant the threat was outside, somewhere among the 700 bikers currently draining the town's liquor supply. Jesse grabbed his creeper, a flashlight, and a pair of heavy wire snips. He slid under the stripped-down frame of the Sovereign. The underside of the bike was immaculate. No road grime, no grease build-up, just pure, clean metal. He angled the beam of the flashlight up into the dark cavity behind the transmission mount. There it was, the thick braided steel line, choked out by a heavy black industrial zip tie. He needed to cut it, but he needed a cover story. "Reno!" Jesse called out from under the bike, his voice echoing slightly off the floor. "What do you want, grease monkey?" "I need a 1/2-inch flare nut wrench, top drawer of the red Mac cabinet. It's buried in the back." He heard Reno mutter a string of curses, followed by the heavy metal sliding of the drawer. The second he was distracted, Jesse reached up with the snips. His hand was shaking. He slid the jaws of the snips over the thick plastic of the zip tie, right where it bit into the braided steel. Snip. The plastic popped. The heavy braided line instantly relaxed, expanding back to its original circular shape. He grabbed the severed zip tie and shoved it deep into the front pocket of his jeans. He started threading a new, temporary fitting onto the end of the line, creating a distraction. "Ain't no flare nut wrench in here," Reno barked. Jesse slid out from under the bike, sitting up on the creeper. "My bad. Must have left it in the truck. Don't worry about it. I found the problem." Dutch was looking at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were tracked onto his hands. "What problem?" Dutch asked. "The return line." Jesse lied, keeping his voice steady, wiping his hands on a rag. The way the old man routed it behind the exhaust bracket. Over time, the heat cycling softened the internal rubber beneath the steel braid. The line collapsed on itself. Starved the bottom end of oil. That's why the bearing blew. Reno scoffed. The old man didn't make routing mistakes. Rubber degrades, Reno. Jesse shot back. It's physics, not disrespect. I'm going to run a bypass, reroute a new line along the outer rail. It won't look factory, but it'll flow. He stood up, turning to grab a length of fresh hose from the wall spool. When he turned back, Dutch was standing right next to him. He was too close. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gripping Jesse's wrist. The grip was loose, but it felt like a steel trap resting around his bones. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely calm, which was infinitely worse. With his free hand, Dutch reached into his own leather cut. He pulled something out and pressed it flat against Jesse's chest. Jesse looked down. It was a heavy, black, industrial zip tie. The exact same brand, size, and gauge as the one currently burning a hole in his pocket. His breath caught in his throat. The shop suddenly felt like a vacuum. Dutch held his eyes. He didn't blink. He lowered his voice so much that Jesse could barely hear him over the hum of the parts washer. The old man didn't make routing mistakes. Dutch whispered, "And I don't believe in degrading rubber." He let go of Jesse's wrist, slipped the zip tie back into his pocket, and took a step back. "Run your bypass, Jesse," Dutch said loudly, his voice returning to its normal, gravelly register. "Make sure it flows." Jesse swallowed hard. His hands were slick with cold sweat. Dutch knew. He knew the bike was sabotaged, and he was using him to fix it without alerting the traitor. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was an unwilling pawn in club politics. It was somewhere past 3 a.m. The frantic, chaotic energy of the biker invasion outside had settled into a heavy, menacing simmer. The sporadic revving of engines had stopped, replaced by the low, guttural snoring of massive men sleeping on the concrete aprons of the gas station and the diner. Inside the bay, the temperature had finally dropped a few degrees, but the air was stale, smelling heavily of burnt propane, assembly lube, and instant coffee. Jesse had placed the John Deere bearing inside the tiny, frost-choked mini-fridge in his office, wedged between 2 frozen burritos and a half-empty bottle of cheap vodka. It had been in there for 2 hours. Thermal contraction. Now came the delicate part. The aluminum engine cases of the Sovereign sat on the workbench. He picked up his propane torch, sparked the striker, and began sweeping the blue flame over the bearing housing of the left case half. You can't just hammer a main bearing into a precision-machined case. The interference fit is too tight. If you force it, you shave microscopic ribbons of aluminum off the walls. The bearing seat's crooked, the crankshaft wobbles, and the engine vibrates itself into shrapnel the second it hits 3,000 revolutions per minute. You have to use physics, heat the aluminum so it expands, freeze the steel so it shrinks. He watched the metal closely. He spat on the aluminum casing. The spit danced and sizzled instantly, evaporating in a microsecond. It was hot enough. "Reno," he said, not looking up. "Go to the office. Open the fridge. Bring me the bearing. Do not drop it. Do not touch the outside race with your bare hands. Use a rag." For once, Reno didn't argue. He walked to the office. A moment later, he returned, holding the freezing steel with a red shop towel. Frost was immediately condensing on the metal in the humid air. "Drop it in," he said, pulling the torch away. "Perfectly straight. Do not force it." Reno hesitated, hovering the heavy bearing over the smoking hot aluminum case. He lowered it. There was a sharp, distinct clack. It dropped perfectly into the seat, bottoming out against the lip without a fraction of an inch to spare. As the temperatures immediately began to equalize, the aluminum shrinking, the steel expanding, A loud metallic groan echoed from the casing. The bearing was locked in. It would take a hydraulic press to get it out now. Jesse let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Good," he muttered. Now came the flywheels, the massive circular hunks of steel that held the crank pin and generated the engine's momentum. He coated the pin in thick, red assembly lube. It looked like blood on his fingers. He slid the flywheels together, inserting the pin through the center of the new bearing. "Get the dial indicator," he told Reno. He bolted the dial indicator to the workbench, resting the tiny, sensitive needle against the outer edge of the flywheel. He spun the heavy steel assembly by hand. The needle jumped. 0.015 inches, 15,000ths of an inch of runout. It sounds like nothing. A human hair is 3,000ths, but in a high-performance engine, 15,000ths of wobble at highway speeds would feel like riding a jackhammer. He grabbed a lead mallet. It was heavy, soft, and designed to move metal without denting it. He found the high spot on the flywheel. He swung the mallet, bringing it down hard against the steel rim. Thud. He spun it again. The needle twitched. 0.008. Better. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the shop was the rhythmic spinning of the heavy steel, the delicate click of the dial indicator, and the dead, heavy thud of the lead mallet. It was a surgical process performed with blunt instruments. His shoulders burned. His eyes were having trouble focusing, the fluorescent lights turning into smeared yellow halos. Thud, spin, thud, spin. The needle barely vibrated. 0.0005. Half a thousandth of an inch. Factory perfect. He stepped back, dropping the lead mallet onto the bench. His hands were shaking from muscle fatigue. He grabbed a tube of grey Yamabond sealant, running a thin, precise bead around the mating surface of the case half. "Case bolts," he said. Reno handed them to him. He dropped the right side of the engine case over the flywheels, pressing it down. It seated with a satisfying wet squelch as the sealant compressed. He threaded the bolts in by hand, then grabbed his torque wrench. Click, click, working in a star pattern, bringing the two halves together perfectly, evenly. When the final bolt clicked at 45 foot-pounds, he leaned heavily against the workbench. The heart of the Sovereign was whole again. It looked strange. The gleaming, custom billet aluminum exterior hiding a gritty, indestructible piece of a 1968 tractor inside. "Chain hoist," Jesse said, his voice barely more than a rasp. Reno grabbed the nylon straps. They wrapped the heavy block and pulled the chains. The engine lifted off the bench, rotating slightly in the air. They pushed the heavy gantry crane over the stripped-down chassis of the motorcycle. Lowering it was agonizing. The tolerances between the frame rails were incredibly tight. They had to angle the heavy block, twisting it sideways, millimeter by millimeter, avoiding scratching the custom paint. Back and down," he grunted, guiding the rear motor mount into the frame cradle. The engine settled onto the mounts with a solid, heavy thud. He grabbed the thick mounting bolts, sliding them through the frame and into the case. He threaded the nuts on and tightened them down. He hooked up the heavy primary chain, bolted the transmission plate back into alignment, and connected the platinum pushrod tubes. Finally, he ran the new oil line. He routed it cleanly along the outside of the frame, bypassing the hidden death trap of the original routing. He clamped it down with aircraft-grade hose clamps. No zip ties. It was 5:15 a.m. The sky outside the plexiglass windows was beginning to shift from pitch black to a bruised, dusty purple. He grabbed a gallon jug of heavy 60-weight racing oil and poured it into the custom tank. The thick, honey-colored fluid glugged slowly. He wiped his hands on a fresh rag and looked at Dutch. He was standing exactly where he had been for the last 3 hours, a silent sentinel in the corner of the shop. "It's together," Jesse said. "Now we see if it blows up." There is no starter button on a machine like the Sovereign. The old man who built it believed that if you didn't have the physical strength to turn the engine over, you had no right to harness the violence it produced. Jesse stood over the bike, his right boot resting lightly on the heavy steel kickstart pedal. The muscles in his thigh were twitching, a rapid, involuntary flutter born of sheer exhaustion. He had been awake for 26 hours. He had consumed nothing but lukewarm tap water and the toxic fumes of burnt mineral spirits. "Turn the petcock," he told Reno. He reached down, twisting the brass valve beneath the gas tank. He watched the thick, amber fuel flow through the clear inline filter. He twisted the throttle grip twice. The S&S carburetor spit a fine, atomized mist of high-octane gasoline directly into the intake manifold. The smell was instant and sharp, cutting through the stale air of the garage like a chemical razor. He turned the ignition switch. The small red oil pressure light on the dash blinked on. He pushed the kickstarter down slowly, feeling for the heavy, undeniable resistance of top dead center. When the piston came up against the compression stroke, the pedal turned into a brick wall. Pushing past it meant risking a kickback, a violent reversal of the pedal that has shattered the shin bones of men twice his size. He took a breath. The air tasted like copper and old dust. He leaped upward, bringing his entire body weight down on the pedal with his right leg. The engine spun. The heavy flywheels churned the thick racing oil. The exhaust pipes let out a hollow, flat chuff of unburnt air, but the spark didn't catch. He stumbled off the pedal, his bad knee popping loudly. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sick, erratic rhythm. "Again," Dutch said from the shadows. He repositioned his boot, found top dead center, stood up on his left leg, and threw his weight down again. Crack chuff spit. A small blue flame shot out of the rear exhaust pipe, accompanied by the distinct smell of burnt gunpowder, but the engine died before it could complete a full rotation. "Timing's off," Reno sneered, crossing his arms. He was leaning against the wall, a sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead, despite the dropping temperature. "You rushed the cam gears. It's going to backfire and blow the intake off." Jesse didn't argue with him. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver, knelt by the ignition cone, and tapped the backing plate 1/8 of an inch clockwise to advance the spark. He stood back up. His vision swam for a second, the edges of the room turning a fuzzy, vibrating gray. He blinked it away. He primed the throttle one more time. He found top dead center. He didn't think about the broken John Deere tractor sitting in the corner. He didn't think about the impossible geometry of the bearing inside the aluminum cases. He just stomped down with everything he had left. The Sovereign exploded into life. The sound in the enclosed concrete bay was physically punishing. It wasn't a hum. It was a concussive, syncopated roar, a violent mechanical heartbeat that rattled the wrenches hanging on his pegboard and sent a fine layer of dust falling from the rafters. The heavy billet block vibrated in the frame, aggressive and angry, spitting a thick cloud of white smoke out of the exhaust as the assembly lube burned off the cylinders. He immediately dropped his eyes to the dash. The red oil pressure light flickered, then died completely. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it on the clear, braided bypass line he had routed along the outer frame rail. Thick, golden oil was surging through the heavy hose, pulsing with the rhythm of the high-volume pump. The bottom end was flooding with lubrication. He reached out and laid his bare palm against the primary cover. The metal was vibrating violently, but the vibration was clean. There was no metal-on-metal grinding, no chaotic rattling. Just the smooth, terrifying power of the massive flywheels spinning on 50-year-old agricultural steel. The tractor bearing was holding. He reached down and twisted the throttle, rolling it open just a 1/4 inch. The engine barked, a sharp, deafening crack that felt like a slap to the chest before settling back into a heavy, loping idle. He killed the ignition. The sudden silence was ringing. His ears whined with a high-pitched frequency. He leaned against the rusted fender of a nearby customer's sedan, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold, concrete floor. He buried his face in his greasy, blistered hands. "Roll it out!" Dutch's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. Jesse looked up. He was already walking toward the roll-up door. The Mojave morning broke fast and brutal. The sky bruised purple, then bled into a blinding, featureless white. The heat returned instantly, baking the moisture out of the air before it even had a chance to settle on the asphalt. Outside, Barstow looked like a war zone. Trash littered the highway. Sleeping bags were rolled out across the cracked sidewalks. As Reno and 2 other patched members pushed the Sovereign out of Bay 2 and into the morning light, the town began to wake up. It started as a low murmur, the sound of heavy bodies shifting on concrete. Then, one by one, the men saw the bike. They stood up. 700 bikers, stiff from sleeping on the ground, hungover, covered in desert dust, silently formed a massive, enclosing horseshoe around the front of his shop. The sheer volume of people was suffocating. Jesse stood by the open bay door, a grease-stained ghost clutching a dirty shop towel. Dutch walked down the ramp and stopped next to his motorcycle. He ran a hand over the perfect, ghosted paint of the gas tank. He checked the routing of the new oil line. Then he looked at Jesse. "Start it," Dutch commanded. Jesse walked through the crowd. The men parted for him, a slow, grudging shift of leather and denim. Up close, they smelled like stale beer, unwashed hair, and exhaust. He stepped up to the bike, flipped the ignition, found compression, and kicked it. It fired on the first strike. A roar went up from the crowd. It wasn't a cheer, it was a guttural, aggressive validation. Men pounded on each other's shoulders. The Sovereign was alive. Their pride was intact. Vegas was on. Dutch held up a single hand. The cheering died. It didn't taper off. It stopped immediately, cut dead by the sheer authority of a man who owned their complete obedience. The idle of the massive engine was the only sound left, thumping heavily against the morning air. Dutch reached over and killed the engine. He walked to the heavy saddlebag strapped to his own road bike parked nearby. He unbuckled the leather straps, pulled out a thick canvas bank bag, and walked back to Jesse. He tossed it. Jesse caught it against his chest. It was heavy. $50,000 in unmarked, rubber-banded stacks of used bills. "The club pays its debts," Dutch said, his flat eyes holding Jesse's. "You did the impossible, Jesse. You have the respect of this patch." "Thanks," Jesse muttered, his throat dry. He just wanted them to leave. He wanted to lock his door and sleep for 3 days. Dutch turned his back on him and faced the crowd. He looked over the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping slowly, methodically. "The Sovereign rides to Vegas." Dutch's voice boomed. It wasn't a yell, but it carried perfectly over the silent crowd. "The Founder's blood stays on the highway, but there is a problem." The air in the lot shifted. The relaxed posture of the men tightened. Hands dropped to belts. The collective mood swung from triumph to immediate, coiled tension. Dutch reached into the front pocket of his vest. He pulled out 2 objects and held them up in the harsh morning sunlight for everyone to see. In his left hand was the thick, severed zip tie. In his right hand was the original braided steel oil line, clearly crimped and ruined by the heavy plastic. "This machine didn't fail," Dutch said, his voice dropping into a register that made Jesse's spine go cold. It was murdered, choked out from the inside. Somebody clamped the return line and hid it behind the exhaust bracket. Somebody wanted the main bearing to cook. Somebody wanted me stranded in the Mojave, looking weak, missing the sit-down with the cartel reps in Nevada. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the crowd. 700 men looking at the man next to them, calculating, assessing. Jesse looked at Reno. He was standing 10 feet to Dutch's right. His face had drained of all color. The smug, aggressive mechanic from the night before was gone. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, listening to the trapdoor latch click. "Reno," Dutch said softly. Reno flinched. "Dutch, listen to me, man. That runaway mechanic, he's lying. He cut that line himself to cover up a mistake. I stood right behind him when he cut it." Dutch interrupted, his voice perfectly even. "He didn't know I was there. I watched him pull it from a cavity that only a man who knows this specific frame could reach. A cavity you have exclusive access to during maintenance." "No!" Reno backed up a step. His hands were shaking. "You're crazy. I bled for this club. I wouldn't touch the founder's bike." "You wouldn't," Dutch agreed, taking a slow step toward him. "Unless the Nevada chapter offered you a sergeant-at-arms patch to make sure I never made it across state lines, to make sure the vote went their way today." Reno's eyes darted frantically around the crowd. He was looking for an exit, looking for an ally. There were none. The men around him had subtly shifted, closing the gaps, forming a solid wall of human muscle and leather. Reno broke. He lunged to his right, shoving a smaller rider aside, his hand diving into his jacket for a weapon. He never even cleared leather. Two massive prospects, the same ones who had guarded the shop doors all night, hit him from behind. It was an impact of pure, kinetic violence. They drove Reno face first into the unforgiving concrete of Jesse's driveway. The sound of his jaw breaking was a sharp, wet crack that echoed louder than the dropping wrench had hours earlier. The crowd didn't gasp. They didn't move. They just watched. Reno thrashed on the ground, bleeding heavily from his mouth, trying to scream, but the heavy steel-toed boot of one of the prospects pinned his neck to the asphalt, choking the sound into a wet gurgle. Dutch walked over to the thrashing man. He looked down with complete, terrifying indifference. He didn't yell. He didn't kick him. "Strip him," Dutch ordered. 4 men stepped out of the crowd. They descended on Reno. They didn't just take his vest. They pulled out heavy lock-blade knives. They cut the leather off his back, slicing through the fabric, peeling the patches away with brutal efficiency. They cut his shirt. They took his boots. They left him on the cracked concrete, wearing nothing but blood-soaked jeans, a broken man stripped of his identity and his protection. "Throw him in the dumpster," Dutch said, turning away. "Let the coyotes have him." They dragged Reno away by his ankles, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood across the dusty gravel of Jesse's lot. Dutch walked back to his bike. He swung a long leg over the saddle. He didn't look back at the dumpster. He didn't look at Jesse. He just hit the starter button on his machine. The departure was a mirror image of the invasion, but infinitely heavier. 700 engines fired in a staggered, rolling wave of combustion. The air turned blue with exhaust smoke, choking the morning light. The vibration returned to the soles of Jesse's boots, shaking the fillings in his teeth. Dutch led the pack. He pulled out onto Main Street, followed immediately by the Sovereign, ridden by a massive sergeant-at-arms who handled the $2.5 million machine like it was a dirt bike. Jesse stood in the doorway and watched them go. It took 20 minutes for the river of black leather and chrome to filter out of the town limits and merge onto Interstate 15 North. Even when they were miles away, he could still hear the collective drone of the engines, a mechanical swarm of locusts moving toward Vegas. Then the silence rushed back in. It was absolute. The diner across the street was empty, the neon open sign dark. The gas station pumps were deserted. The dust kicked up by 1,000 tires hung suspended in the still, dead desert air, drifting lazily across the cracked asphalt. He turned around and walked back into his shop. The bay was a disaster zone. Used oil stained the concrete. Bloody shop towels were piled in the corner. Empty cans of solvent and stripped bolts littered the workbench. And there, sitting on a wooden pallet like a discarded organ, was the gutted, rusted-out block of the 1968 John Deere tractor. He walked over to it. He traced a finger along the heavy cast iron. Somewhere on a highway doing 90 miles an hour, The heart of this dead machine was beating inside the chest of a $2 million myth. It shouldn't have worked. It defied engineering logic. But desperation is a much better mechanic than precision. He walked to his office, an 8x8 plywood box in the back corner of the building. He tossed the canvas bank bag onto his battered metal desk. It landed heavily on top of a stack of past-due light bills and property tax notices. He pulled the zipper back. The smell of old paper and ink drifted up. $50,000. It was more money than he had seen in 5 years. It was enough to pay off the bank. It was enough to buy a new lift. It was enough to leave Barstow entirely and start over somewhere it rained. He reached out and picked up a stack of hundreds. His hands were still shaking. The grease was permanently embedded in his fingerprints, stained black under the nails, cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. He dropped the money back into the bag. He walked out of the office and back into the main bay. The heat was already rising, the tin roof of the garage expanding and popping under the sun. He grabbed his creeper, a rag, and a half-empty can of WD-40. He walked over to the beaten-up 98 Tacoma sitting in Bay 1. The same truck he had been under when the concrete first began to hum 24 hours ago. He lay down on the plastic creeper, slid under the rusted chassis, and stared up at the seized tie rod end. The rust flakes fell into his eyes, mixing with the sweat. He raised the breaker bar. The world outside was heavy. People killed each other over pride, over patches, over pinched oil lines. But under the truck, it was just him and the stuck metal. He braced his boots against the tire, took a deep breath of the hot, copper-scented air, and pulled. That's the thing about survival. It rarely looks pretty, and it never leaves you clean. A rusted tractor heart kept a $2 million myth riding toward Vegas, and a bag of blood money bought his quiet life back. But out in the Mojave, peace is just a pause between dust storms. If this story of raw grease, broken knuckles, and heavy metal kept your blood pumping, don't let the engine die here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who knows the true cost of a miracle, and subscribe for more mechanical nightmares. Drop a comment below with your craziest roadside fix.